The room smelled of antiseptic, sterile, and cold, a scent that somehow carried the weight of finality. The hum of machines filled the silence, punctuating the quiet with reminders of time passing, life measured in numbers and beeps. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together like a fragile shield against a world that had suddenly grown too heavy. "They've done all they can," the doctor said gently, as though words could cushion the blow. "There's nothing more we can do." He heard the words, but at first, they didn't fully register. He had anticipated this conversation, feared it, and yet when it came, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. The walls seemed closer, the lights harsher, the shadows longer. For a moment, he wanted to shut his eyes and pretend the words were meant for someone else. Outside, the world went on as usual. Cars honked, lights flickered, people rushed past, unaware of the storm raging inside this small hospital room. Friends and family sat around him, faces etched with worry, yet even their presence could not pierce the numbness that had settled deep in his chest. "They're right," someone whispered, not a doctor, not a nurse, but someone he had trusted to share in his life. "Maybe it's time to let go." And in that instant, he felt the weight of every expectation, every hope, every promise of life that had carried him this far. He had always been the one people counted on. The one who smiled when others cried, who worked tirelessly, who gave without question. And now, when it was his turn to be cared for, to cling to hope, everyone was telling him to surrender. The room felt colder. The hum of the machines grew louder, sharper, a reminder that time didn't wait for anyone. He closed his eyes and leaned back against the wall, letting his head rest against the rough paint, rougher still in the way it pressed him down into reality. He could feel the edges of despair pressing in, small at first, then expanding, consuming, relentless. He had dreams. Big ones. Silent ones. Simple ones. A life where he mattered, where he was more than a statistic or a patient. And now, as the words echoed in his mind, the idea of those dreams seemed absurd, almost cruel. And yet, even in that darkness, a stubborn spark flickered. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, buried under layers of fear, pain, and exhaustion. It whispered faintly, almost mocking him, "Not yet. Not like this. Don't give them the satisfaction." He sat there, listening to the voice, holding onto it like a lifeline. His body ached. His mind reeled. His heart felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of every lost opportunity, every mistake, every hope deferred. And yet, that small, defiant voice refused to be silenced. He thought of the people who had once relied on him, the friends who had smiled because of his persistence, the strangers who had been touched by his kindness. He thought of the small victories he had celebrated, quietly finishing a project, helping someone in need, holding on through a storm. All of it mattered. And if it mattered to him, maybe it still mattered to someone else. He opened his eyes slowly, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights above him flickering slightly, a reminder that nothing was perfect, but everything was still here. He traced the cracks in the paint with his gaze and let the quiet sink in. And then, for the first time that day, he prayed. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just a simple, whispered plea. "If this is the end, give me the strength to face it." His voice trembled, barely audible over the hum of machines, but the words were real, and that was enough. And deep down, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, the same voice whispered again, "Not yet. You're not done. You're stronger than they think." The hours passed slowly. Visitors came and went, their faces a mixture of pity and hope. He responded with small gestures, a nod, a quiet smile, a squeeze of the hand, but he kept that spark alive. He refused to give them the satisfaction of surrender. As night fell, the city outside glowed through the window. Lights reflected in the glass, creating a million tiny stars that danced in rhythm with his heartbeat. He watched them for a long time, and for the first time, he didn't think about what he couldn't do. He thought about what he could still try. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the path ahead would be hard, painful, lonely at times. But he also knew that giving up would be far worse. Even when everyone said it was time, he refused to surrender. Not yet, not like this. For in the silence of that hospital room, amid the hum of machines and whispered doubts, one truth remained clear: he wasn't finished. And maybe, just maybe, what happened next would change everything. The days that followed were heavy, each one pressing down like the night before, stretching endlessly, testing his resolve. Visitors came and went, their smiles strained, their voices polite but distant. The words "there's nothing more we can do" lingered in every conversation, like a shadow hovering over his bed. He noticed the subtle shift in their eyes, a combination of pity, fear, and quiet resignation. They had already let go, he hadn't. Pain became routine. Physical pain, emotional pain, the ache of being alive yet so fragile. Doubt became a constant companion, whispering in his ear at every turn. Why bother? You've already lost. Stop trying. It was tempting to give in, to let the world decide for him, to accept the verdict handed down by well-meaning doctors and even well-meaning friends. But he refused. One evening, when the sky outside was dark and heavy with rain, a janitor quietly entered his room. No clipboard. No questions. No hurried glance at a chart. Just presence. Mind if I sit? The man asked softly. He nodded. The man didn't rush him, didn't offer clichés. He simply sat on the corner of the bed, a steady presence in a room that felt increasingly unstable. For a long time, they didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. Sometimes, the most powerful gestures are simply sharing space with someone, letting them know they are not entirely alone. Finally, the janitor spoke, his voice quiet, deliberate. Miracles don't always look like miracles at first, he said. The words hung in the air, strange and almost inconvenient, but somehow comforting. Daniel turned the idea over in his mind. Miracles. The word seemed foreign, almost impossible. But maybe he had misunderstood them all along. Perhaps a miracle wasn't always a dramatic, life-altering event. Perhaps it could be subtle. Patient. Waiting. He thought back to his life before this room, before the pain. All the times he had almost given up. All the moments when someone, stranger or friend, had offered kindness he hadn't expected. Each of those moments had been small miracles, unnoticed at the time, but transformative in ways he couldn't fully articulate. And then he thought of the stubborn spark inside him, the quiet voice that had refused to accept finality the night before. Not yet. That night, lying in the dim glow of the hospital lights, he didn't ask why he was still here. He asked a different question. A question that felt dangerous, like stepping into unknown territory without a map. What if I keep going anyway? He closed his eyes and let the thought sink in. Not out of arrogance. Not because he expected certainty. But because hope, however fragile, deserved a chance. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of nurses moving through the hallway, the soft chatter of patients. The sun had barely risen, and the room was still cool, tinged with the scent of antiseptic and rain. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if his body were remembering a rhythm it had forgotten. He decided he would try. One more treatment. Not because he was promised results. Not because anyone guaranteed him a happy ending. He tried because surrender felt worse than enduring pain, worse than facing failure, worse than the fear of disappointment. The process was brutal. Exhaustion seeped into every bone, every muscle, every thought. There were moments when the pain seemed unbearable, when doubt screamed louder than hope. People shook their heads. You don't have to do this, they said. It's not worth it. But Daniel persisted. Every morning, he woke and faced the machines, the needles, the medications, the tests. Every evening, he lay in bed, counting the small victories of the day, the moments he smiled despite exhaustion, the strength to pick up a spoon, the courage to look someone in the eye. And slowly, something extraordinary began to happen, not in the numbers, not in the charts, not in any miraculous scan, but in the subtle transformations around him. A nurse started calling him the fighter, a title he hadn't earned, yet one he accepted with quiet pride. Other patients noticed his persistence, drew strength from his determination, and even in their own struggles found sparks of courage. Hope, it seemed, had contagious power. Even on the nights when his body failed him, when the pain was relentless, his spirit refused to break. Each small victory became a brick in a foundation he was quietly building, one moment of defiance at a time. And then, one morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds and dust motes danced like tiny stars, the doctor walked in with an expression he had never seen before. Not triumph. Not certainty. Just surprise. A subtle shift, but enough. Enough to remind Daniel that sometimes the world doesn't move in the way we expect, but moves nonetheless. It wasn't a miracle yet. It wasn't a clear victory. But it was a sign. A sign that refusing to give up, even when everyone said he should, could ripple further than anyone imagined. For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself a quiet smile. Because even when faith is tested, even when hope feels impossible, the choice to keep going can be the first step toward changing everything. Daniel stared at the blank hospital ceiling, tracing the faint cracks with his tired eyes. The hum of machines was constant, a reminder of every heartbeat, every breath, every second still granted to him. The words of his doctors, family, and friends had echoed in his mind for days. There's nothing more we can do. Maybe it's time to let go. Be realistic. But in that quiet, heavy room, another voice persisted. Not yet. It wasn't pride, exactly. Not stubbornness. Not bravado. It was something quieter, more profound. A spark of belief that lingered despite the pain, doubt, and fear. A conviction that life, messy, fragile, uncertain, was still worth fighting for. He made the decision that would change everything. Not because anyone promised a miracle. Not because he was guaranteed a future. Not because his body was ready. But because surrender felt heavier than every option before him. He would keep going. One more treatment. One more step. One more day. The treatment was grueling. Pain throbbed in ways he hadn't imagined, fatigue sank into his bones, and moments of despair clawed at him relentlessly. Friends shook their heads. Nurses offered sympathetic glances. You don't have to do this, they said softly. It's okay to let go. But he pressed on. Each day became a test of endurance. Each night, a quiet triumph for surviving one more cycle. Even when his body ached and hope felt like a distant memory, Daniel refused to allow the darkness to claim him. Slowly, the small victories accumulated. Rising from bed without assistance. Eating a meal without losing his strength. Smiling at a nurse who had seen too many patients give up. Other patients began to notice. They called him the fighter in whispers at first, then openly. His determination became contagious. People who had once succumbed to despair now drew courage from his presence. Nurses smiled when he walked into a room. Staff members who had grown weary found renewed energy simply from watching him endure. Daniel didn't fully understand it at the time, but he was becoming more than a patient fighting for his own life. He was becoming a symbol, unintended, quiet, but undeniably powerful, of hope that refused to die. One evening, after another exhausting treatment, he sat in the corner of the hospital room, exhausted and sweaty, listening to the night settle over the city outside. The janitor who had visited weeks earlier stopped by again, quietly handing him a cup of tea. Miracles, the janitor said softly, don't always look like miracles at first. Daniel held the cup, warmth seeping into his palms, and realized he had already begun to live one. He was witnessing a different kind of miracle, not instantaneous or obvious, but persistent, subtle, and quietly transformative. Each choice to continue, each refusal to give up, became a brick in a foundation of something larger than himself. The next morning, a subtle shift began to appear in the medical charts. Numbers that had been stagnant for weeks began to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a miracle in the way anyone expected. But it was enough, a faint glimmer of proof that persistence, faith, and defiance could ripple outward, changing the impossible into the possible. The doctors noticed. Their cautious expressions softened. Nurses exchanged glances, whispering to one another. Even patients in the halls began to sense the change, asking quietly about the man who refused to surrender. Daniel felt it too, not in the charts, not in the medical jargon, but in his body, in his spirit, in the fragile yet undeniable strength that had returned. His heart, once heavy with despair, now held a cautious hope. It was a slow journey. Pain remained. Fear remained. The shadow of doubt never fully disappeared. But with each treatment, with each day survived, Daniel began to realize something extraordinary. The choice to keep going, even when everyone else told him to give up, had power. Not just for him. For everyone who watched. For everyone who had whispered it's over and been proven wrong. For everyone who needed proof that hope could endure, even in the darkest moments. By the end of that week, Daniel was no longer just a patient. He was a testament. A quiet, living example that even in circumstances that seemed hopeless, refusing to give up could spark change far beyond oneself. And in that realization, Daniel understood the truth that would guide him for the rest of his life: miracles are not always dramatic. Sometimes, they are persistence. Sometimes, they are quiet courage. Sometimes, they are the unwavering decision to rise, one more time, when the world says it's too late. That night, he closed his eyes and whispered again. Not a prayer of despair this time, but a promise. I will keep going. Not for anyone else, but for the chance to show what hope can do. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that what happened next, what no one expected, would restore faith, not only in him, but in everyone who had dared to watch. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital blinds, casting stripes across the floor like hope itself had begun to reach into the room. Daniel sat up slowly, muscles sore, body exhausted from nights of restless sleep and grueling treatments. Yet, there was a subtle difference in the air today, a quiet tension, a feeling that something was about to change. The door opened, and the doctor stepped in, expression hesitant, brows drawn together in disbelief. Daniel had learned not to expect miracles, not to read too much into every gesture, but something in the doctor's eyes made him pause. Daniel, the doctor began, carefully, almost cautiously, we've reviewed your latest results. Daniel braced himself, expecting disappointment, expecting the same resignation he had heard so many times before. But what came next was different. The numbers, they've improved. Gradually, yes, but undeniably. Against every expectation, you're responding. Medically, we can't explain it, but it's happening. Daniel blinked, processing the words. They felt unreal. A whisper of hope brushed against the walls of his mind, careful not to overwhelm him yet daring him to believe. He looked down at his hands, hands that had trembled with pain and weakness, now holding the possibility of life in their own subtle strength. The news traveled quickly through the hospital corridors. Nurses, doctors, even patients who had known him from the beginning began to notice the change. Where despair had once hovered, whispers of awe replaced it. The man who had been told to give up was still standing. The man who had endured beyond anyone's expectations was alive in ways no one could fully explain. Daniel didn't fully understand it himself. This wasn't instant recovery. This wasn't a miraculous cure in the way movies or stories would describe. Pain lingered. Fatigue remained. The journey was far from over. But the evidence of his persistence, the power of refusing to surrender, was now undeniable. Other patients, some weary and broken, began to watch him. Quietly at first, then with fascination. They had seen him smile through exhaustion, speak softly to those around him, keep fighting when even the strongest voices had told him to stop. And now, they could see the first tangible results of his resilience. It wasn't just numbers on a chart. It wasn't just scans or readings. It was something far more profound. Hope. The ability to witness hope triumph, even slowly, had a weight that no machine could measure. A fellow patient approached him that afternoon, eyes wide. I don't know how you do it," they said. "I would have given up." Daniel shook his head gently. "You're stronger than you think. You just have to keep going. One day at a time." Words he had spoken without realizing their depth now carried a life-altering weight. He had lived them. Each painful step, each decision to continue when it would have been easier to surrender, had built a quiet authority, a truth that was impossible to deny. Over the next few weeks, the change continued. Gradually, consistently, against every forecast. Machines that had only beeped with routine monotony now recorded progress. Doctors were astonished. Nurses exchanged knowing smiles, many of them quietly inspired by his perseverance. Patients began to stand taller, hope rekindled in ways that words alone could not express. Daniel, for his part, didn't claim credit. He didn't see himself as extraordinary. He had simply refused to give up. That small act of defiance, stubborn, quiet, personal, had rippled far beyond his own life, touching everyone who bore witness to it. And then, the moment came that would never leave him. He walked out of the hospital for the first time in months. The sun shone bright, city streets alive with the hum of life. People paused, looked. Some whispered. Some simply watched. Because here was a man they had all been told to let go. Here was a man who had refused. Here was hope, alive, breathing, walking before them. Daniel felt it in the air, the unspoken recognition, the awe, the relief. He had been given nothing miraculous in the instant sense, but the effect was undeniable. Faith had been restored not only in the possibility of life against odds, but in the human spirit's capacity to endure, to persist, to survive when all else seems lost. Later that night, as he sat quietly on a bench overlooking the city, he reflected on what had brought him here. Pain, struggle, exhaustion, despair, but also a choice. One stubborn, defiant choice to keep moving forward when everyone else had turned away. That choice had not only changed his own life but had quietly restored faith in everyone who had dared to watch. Daniel understood something fundamental: miracles weren't always loud. They didn't always announce themselves with grandeur. Sometimes, miracles were subtle. Sometimes, they were persistence in the face of impossibility. Sometimes, they were the quiet courage to keep going when all voices say, "Give up." And tonight, the city lights twinkled like tiny beacons of possibility. Because one man's refusal to surrender had reminded everyone around him that hope, no matter how fragile, was never truly lost. Daniel stood at the entrance of the hospital once more, not as a patient, not as someone fighting for survival, but as a quiet witness to what hope could do. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers from the lobby, a blend that reminded him of nights spent in isolation, battling pain and doubt. He looked around the bustling corridors, filled with the hum of life, footsteps echoing, voices whispering, monitors beeping. Some of the patients caught his gaze, their expressions uncertain, weary, afraid. For a fleeting moment, he remembered himself in their place, the desperation, the fear, the suffocating weight of being told, over and over, "It's over." He carried a stack of papers and pamphlets from the outreach program, part of a new initiative to support patients who were struggling, unsure, or ready to give up. But more than anything, he carried his story, a story of refusal, of quiet courage, of the slow, grueling work of keeping hope alive. A young man, barely out of his teens, sat slumped in the waiting area, head down, shoulders hunched, a cardboard sign tucked beside him. Daniel froze, memories crashing in. He recognized the posture, the hopelessness, the feeling of being invisible. The man's eyes flicked up, wary, as Daniel approached. "Hey," Daniel said gently. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had been where the young man was. "It's hard, isn't it?" The young man hesitated. "Yeah," he muttered. Daniel knelt, just as someone once knelt for him. "I know it feels like everyone's given up on you. But there's a way forward. You don't have to do it alone." He handed the young man a small folded piece of paper. On it was an address, a contact, and a simple message: "You are not finished." The young man stared at it, disbelief written across his face. "Why are you helping me?" he asked softly. Daniel smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Because someone once helped me. And that one small act changed everything. Sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to give up on you." Across the room, nurses and staff watched. Some whispered. Some held back tears. They had seen Daniel transform over months of uncertainty. They had watched despair give way to resilience, and now they were seeing the next ripple begin, hope spreading, quietly, naturally, to those who had none left. Weeks passed, and Daniel continued to visit, sharing time, listening, and guiding patients who were struggling. He didn't have magic words, nor did he claim to have all the answers. But he had something far more powerful: lived experience. He had survived the impossible by refusing to surrender, and that story carried weight no medical chart could ever measure. One evening, as he walked through the quiet hallways, he spotted a familiar figure: Maria. She had been there from the very beginning, a gentle presence in the darkness when no one else had cared enough to stop. Her eyes met his, and a shared smile passed between them. "You made it," she said simply. Daniel nodded. "I'm still here. Because of one choice, and because someone once believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." She reached out, a hand on his shoulder. "You've given that to others now. You've become the miracle for them." He felt the truth of her words resonate deeply. What had begun as a single act of defiance, one man refusing to give up, had transformed into something far larger. Faith had been restored not just in him, but in everyone who had watched, in everyone who had dared to hope again. As Daniel left the hospital that night, city lights stretching out like a constellation of possibility, he reflected on the journey. There had been pain, fear, doubt, exhaustion, but also courage, determination, and the subtle power of refusing to surrender. He understood now what miracles truly were. They weren't always sudden. They weren't always dramatic. Sometimes, miracles were patience. Sometimes, they were endurance. Sometimes, they were the quiet, unwavering decision to rise one more time, when every voice says give up. Daniel knew his story would never be forgotten, not by him, not by the lives he touched, not by the people whose faith he had restored by simply choosing to keep going. And for anyone watching, listening, or struggling in silence, there was a single, undeniable truth. You are never truly finished. One small act of courage can change everything. That night, Daniel looked up at the sky. Stars flickered faintly, distant but unyielding. Just like him. Just like hope. And somewhere deep inside, he smiled, knowing that the ripple he had started would continue far beyond himself. Because he had refused to give up. And in doing so, he had restored faith one life at a time.